He used to run the city with a single phone call. Now he couldn't even pour his own coffee without his hands shaking. He had fired 6 nurses in 3 weeks. They all looked at him with the same sickly, suffocating pity. Then she walked in. She was 30 minutes late, bleeding from a paper cut on her forehead, and smelled faintly of cheap tequila and burnt toast. She didn't look at him like a tragedy. She looked at him like a problem. And for the first time in 6 months, he felt something other than dead. The wrought iron gates of the Navarro estate looked like they belonged on a medieval fortress, not a private residence in the hills. Stella Quinn sat in her beat-up 2012 Honda Civic, watching the engine temperature gauge inch dangerously close to the red line. She slammed her palm against the dashboard. "Not today, please, just give me 2 hours." The engine rattled in response, letting out a pitiful hiss of steam. Stella killed the ignition and grabbed her tote bag. It was filled with crumpled receipts, 3 half-empty packs of gum, and a nursing certificate that felt more like a cruel joke than a qualification. She was broke. Not the eat ramen for a week kind of broke, but the ignoring calls from unlisted numbers because they are collection agencies kind of broke. She stepped out into the biting wind. The intercom at the gate crackled. "Name." The voice was entirely devoid of warmth. "Stella Quinn. I'm here for the caregiving position. The agency sent me." A heavy mechanical groan echoed as the gates slowly parted. Stella walked up the winding driveway. The gravel crunched loudly under her scuffed boots. The house itself was a sprawling, brutalist structure of concrete and dark glass. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a tomb. At the front door stood a man who looked like he chewed gravel for breakfast. He wore a tailored suit that barely contained his shoulders. His nose had clearly been broken more than once. "Arms out," he said. "Excuse me. Arms out. Standard protocol." He didn't wait for her to comply, stepping forward with a metal detector wand. He patted down her sides, his face a mask of professional indifference. "I'm Frankie. You're late. There was an accident on the highway, and my car is essentially held together by duct tape and hope." Stella replied, her voice trembling slightly. She tried to smile. It felt brittle. Frankie just stared at her. "He's in the study. Don't touch anything on the desk. Don't adjust the blinds. And if he tells you to leave, you leave." Stella followed Frankie through the echoing hallways. The air inside was stiflingly sterile. It smelled like bleach, old wood, and something metallic she couldn't quite place. There were no photographs on the walls, no signs of life. Frankie pushed open a set of heavy oak doors and stepped aside. The study was cast in shadows. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the afternoon sun. Behind a massive mahogany desk, bathed in the dim light of a single reading lamp, sat Jonah Navarro. Stella stopped a few feet from the desk. Jonah didn't look up. He was staring out the sliver of window where the curtains didn't quite meet, his jaw set in a hard, rigid line. He wore a dark shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. His face was sharp, aristocratic, lined with a weariness that went straight to the bone. And then she saw the wheelchair. High-backed, mechanized, imposing. "The agency must be scraping the bottom of the barrel," Jonah said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate against the floorboards. "You're late, you're disheveled, and you're bleeding." Stella instinctively touched her forehead, wincing as her fingers brushed the paper cut she'd gotten fighting with her apartment complex's broken mailbox. "It's just a scratch. I can still push a wheelchair and dispense medication." Jonah slowly turned his head. His eyes were cold, hollow, and utterly devoid of mercy. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the worst of the world and decided to become it. He scanned her up and down, making her feel entirely inadequate and entirely seen all at once. "I fired the last nurse because she hovered," Jonah said softly. "The one before that because she cried when she saw the scars on my legs. What is your tragic flaw, Miss Quinn?" Stella felt a sudden, reckless surge of irritation. She was tired, hungry, and entirely out of patience for brooding billionaires. "I talk when I shouldn't. I have zero filter when I'm stressed, and I am prone to dropping things. But I need this job. And frankly, Mr. Navarro, you look like you need a shower and a decent meal, not someone to hold your hand and sing you lullabies." The silence in the room became absolute. Frankie, standing by the door, actually stopped breathing. Stella realized her mistake a second too late. Her hands gripped the handles of her tote bag until her knuckles turned white. She had just insulted a man rumored to run half the illegal imports on the seaboard. Jonah stared at her. The muscle in his jaw twitched. His hands, resting on the arms of his wheelchair, remained perfectly still. For a long, agonizing moment, he did nothing. Then he leaned back. "You're hired," he said. Stella blinked. "I am? Yes. But if you drop my medication, you'll be replacing it out of your salary. Start tomorrow at 6. He turned his chair away, dismissing her entirely. "Frankie, show her out, and get someone to fix her car. It's an eyesore on my driveway." Caregiving, stripped of its clinical terminology, is an intimate, brutal invasion of privacy. Stella learned this on day 2. Jonah Navarro was paralyzed from the mid-chest down, a parting gift from a rival syndicate sniper rifle 6 months ago. His spinal cord was severely damaged, leaving his legs useless and his torso weak. He required help with everything: transfers from the bed to the chair, showering, dressing. He hated it. He hated her for doing it. The first time she had to use the mechanical lift to move him from the bed to his wheelchair, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Jonah stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful, refusing to acknowledge his own helplessness. "Okay, going up," Stella said, trying to keep her voice light, adjusting the canvas sling under his thighs. She accidentally pinched a fold of his skin. Jonah flinched. A sharp, venomous breath hissed through his teeth. "Watch your hands, damn it!" "Sorry," she snapped back, her own stress flaring. "It's hard to maneuver when you're rigid as a board. Relax." "I am paralyzed, Stella. Rigid is all I have." He spat, his dark eyes flashing with sudden fury. It was a stark, ugly truth. She didn't apologize again. She just secured the straps, hoisted him into the chair, and tossed a blanket over his legs. "Coffee's in the kitchen. Black, no sugar, right? If you burn it again, I'm firing you," he muttered, adjusting his collar with jerky, uncoordinated movements of his hands. The sniper's bullet had caused nerve damage that radiated into his arms on bad days. Stella's presence in the house was like a localized tornado. She was chaotic, uncoordinated, and entirely unapologetic. She dropped a tray of crystal glasses on day 3, shattering them across the imported marble floor. Instead of cowering, she had grabbed a broom and cursed loudly about the impracticality of smooth flooring. Jonah had wheeled himself to the doorway of the kitchen, watching her sweep with a bizarre mixture of annoyance and fascination. By day 5, a strange rhythm had developed. Stella refused to let him eat in the dark study. She forced open the heavy curtains in the dining room, flooding the space with aggressive afternoon sunlight. Jonah hated the light. It highlighted the hollows of his cheeks and the pallor of his skin. "I'm not eating out here," he growled, shielding his eyes as she set down a plate of grilled chicken and quinoa. "You look like a vampire. Eat your protein. Dr. Aris said you're losing muscle mass." Stella ordered, sitting down opposite him with a massive, overstuffed burrito she had bought from a food truck. Jonah glared at the quinoa. "This looks like birdseed." "It's healthy. I own 3 restaurants. I'm not eating birdseed." He pushed the plate away. Stella sighed, a long, dramatic sound, and pushed it back toward him. "Eat it or I'm putting hot sauce on it." "You wouldn't dare." Stella pulled a small bottle of cheap habanero sauce from her tote bag and slammed it onto the mahogany table. Jonah stared at the bottle, then at her. A muscle in his cheek twitched. It wasn't anger. It was something dangerously close to amusement. He picked up his fork. That night, the reality of his world crashed back down. Stella was in the adjoining bathroom, organizing his medications, when she heard a low, guttural groan from the bedroom. She dropped the pill bottle and rushed in. Jonah was gripping the bed rails, his chest heaving, his face pale and slick with sweat. His legs were spasming violently, severe neurogenic spasms that rippled through his useless muscles, twisting them into unnatural, agonizing angles. "Jonah," she said, dropping to her knees beside the bed. "Don't," he choked out, squeezing his eyes shut. "Don't look at me." He was humiliated. The great boss reduced to a thrashing, helpless body. Stella ignored him. She knew the protocol. She placed her hands firmly just above his knees, applying steady, even pressure to counteract the spasticity. She didn't coo at him. She didn't offer empty platitudes. "Breathe," she ordered, her voice firm and grounded. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Fight the panic, not the muscle." He opened his eyes, staring down at her. His chest rose and fell sharply. Stella kept her grip steady, grounding him, offering her own physical strength as an anchor, while his nervous system misfired. They stayed like that for 10 minutes. The only sound in the room was the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock and the ragged rhythm of his breathing. Gradually, the spasms subsided. His legs went limp again. Dead weight. Stella slowly released her grip, her own muscles aching. She stood up, grabbed a towel, and gently wiped the sweat from his forehead. Jonah didn't push her away. He looked up at the ceiling, his voice hollow. "It doesn't hurt. That's the worst part. My brain thinks I'm in agony, but I can't feel a damn thing below my ribs." Stella didn't offer pity. She just pulled the heavy duvet over his legs. "We'll adjust the baclofen dosage tomorrow. Try to sleep." As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her in the doorway. "Stella." She looked back. "The chicken," Jonah muttered, closing his eyes. It was dry. A small, genuine smile broke across her face. "Noted, boss. The underworld does not wait for a man to heal." Weakness in Jonah's line of work was blood in the water. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the living room. Stella was in the kitchen, humming off-key to a radio station she had forced onto the smart home system, trying to salvage a pot of minestrone soup she had aggressively oversalted. The heavy front doors opened. Frankie's voice echoed down the hall, tense and clipped. Stella wiped her hands on her apron and peeked around the corner. 3 men had entered the foyer. They weren't wearing the sharp, tailored suits of Jonah's men. They wore heavy leather coats, dripping rainwater onto the pristine marble. The man in the center, tall, graying, with a thick scar running down his throat, was smiling. It was a terrible, predatory smile. "Frankie," the man said smoothly. "Tell the boss I'm here to check on his health." Frankie stepped into the man's path, his hand resting casually near the bulge inside his jacket. "Mr. Navarro is resting. No unannounced visits. You know the rules, Victor. Rules change when the king is confined to a wheelchair." Victor sneered, stepping closer. "I'm not asking, Frankie." Before Frankie could draw, the 2 men flanking Victor produced heavy, silenced pistols, pointing them squarely at Frankie's chest. The air in the hallway turned to ice. Stella froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She should run. She should hit the panic button in the kitchen and hide in the pantry. That was what a normal person would do. Instead, she heard the soft, mechanical hum of Jonah's wheelchair approaching from the study. Jonah rolled into the hallway. He looked impossibly pale, the dark circles under his eyes prominent in the gloomy light. He took in the scene in a fraction of a second. The drawn guns, Victor's smug face, Frankie's rigid stance. Jonah didn't flinch. He steered his chair forward, stopping 10 feet from the intruders. "Victor," Jonah said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a deadly weight. "You're tracking mud on my floors." Victor laughed, an ugly, grating sound. "You look terrible, Jonah. Word on the street is you're barely functioning, that your territory on the docks is practically unguarded. Word on the street is often exaggerated." Jonah replied calmly. Put the guns away before I have Frankie mount your heads in my garage. Frankie's outnumbered, Victor said, taking a step toward Jonah. You're done, Rossi. I'm here for the harbor ledgers. Hand them over, and maybe we let you retire to a nice nursing home. Jonah's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. He was trapped. He couldn't fight. He couldn't even stand up. For the first time, Stella saw a flicker of raw, unadulterated rage and helplessness cross his face. She didn't think. Stella marched out of the kitchen, her apron still tied around her waist. In her right hand, she gripped a massive cast-iron soup ladle she had just been using. It weighed about 3 pounds and looked vaguely medieval. She stepped right between Jonah's wheelchair and Victor. "Excuse me," Stella said, her voice loud and abrasive, cutting through the lethal tension like a chainsaw. "Are you blind? I just mopped that floor." Victor blinked, completely thrown off guard by the chaotic woman in a stained apron standing between him and his target. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the one who's going to crack your skull with this ladle if you don't take your muddy boots off my clean floor." Stella lied. She was terrified. Her knees were shaking. But she squared her shoulders, pointing the dripping ladle at Victor's chest. A dollop of overly salted tomato broth splattered onto his expensive leather coat. Victor looked down at the red stain. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "You stupid bitch!" He reached out to backhand her. Jonah moved faster than anyone anticipated. His hand shot out, grabbing Stella's apron string and yanking her violently backward, out of Victor's reach. "Frankie now!" Jonah roared. With Victor distracted for that crucial half-second, Frankie moved. He swiped the barrel of the nearest gun away, driving his knee into the man's stomach, drawing his own weapon in a blur of motion. Within 3 seconds, Frankie had his gun pressed directly between Victor's eyes. The 2 heavily armed goons hesitated, looking at their boss, who now had a 9mm kissing his forehead. "Drop them!" Frankie growled. The heavy thud of the silenced pistols hitting the marble echoed through the hall. Jonah exhaled slowly. He looked at Victor, his eyes dead and cold. "The harbor belongs to me. If you ever walk into my home again, Victor, you won't walk out. Frankie, escort them out. Break his kneecaps on the driveway so he remembers the lesson." Victor swallowed hard, all the bravado draining from his face as Frankie shoved him towards the door. Once the heavy doors slammed shut, the house fell into a deafening silence. Stella was breathing heavily, her back pressed against the wall. She looked down at the ladle in her hand, suddenly realizing how incredibly stupid she had just been. She dropped it. It clattered loudly against the floor. Jonah turned his wheelchair to face her. He stared at her for a long time. The anger had vanished from his face, replaced by a profound, baffled disbelief. "A ladle," Jonah said softly. "You brought a soup ladle to a gunfight." "It's cast iron," Stella whispered, her voice cracking. "It's heavy." Jonah closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. A low sound escaped his chest. It took Stella a moment to realize what it was. He was laughing. It wasn't a happy sound. It was dark, raspy, and entirely devoid of humor, born out of sheer adrenaline and absurdity. He opened his eyes, looking up at her. The cold, impenetrable wall he had built around himself had cracked. "You are a complete disaster, Stella Quinn," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its sharp edge. "I told you I had no filter when I was stressed," she muttered, sliding down the wall to sit on the floor, burying her face in her hands. Jonah rolled his chair closer. He leaned forward, ignoring the strain in his back. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his fingers brushed against the messy crown of her hair. It was a clumsy, unpracticed gesture of comfort. "Don't ever step in front of a gun for me again," he said. It wasn't an order. It was a plea. Stella looked up at him, her heart doing a strange, entirely unhelpful flutter. "You pay me to keep you alive, boss. I'm just doing my job." Jonah's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The air between them suddenly felt very thick, charged with something entirely unprofessional and entirely dangerous. That Jonah murmured, was not in the job description. The atmosphere in the house changed after the ladle incident. The crushing, sterile silence was replaced by a tense, vibrating energy. Frankie broke Victor's kneecaps on the gravel driveway just as Jonah had ordered. The wet, sickening crunch had echoed all the way to the kitchen window. Stella had thrown up in the sink. Jonah had sat in the dark study, listening to the screams, his face a mask of stone. The underworld knew Jonah Navarro was paralyzed, but now they also knew he was not a corpse. With the threat of war looming, Jonah stopped sleeping. He spent his nights at the heavy mahogany desk, a cold cup of coffee at his elbow, analyzing shipping manifests and burner phone logs. His empire was bleeding out, and he was desperately trying to apply a tourniquet with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Stella instituted a new rule on Thursday: physical therapy. Now, she said, marching into the study at 2 in the afternoon. She carried a thick yoga mat and a set of resistance bands. Jonah didn't look up from his laptop. I have 3 shipments sitting at the docks. The Port Authority is asking questions. Go away, Stella. Dr. Aris said you need passive range of motion exercises daily, or your joints will permanently contract. I am not letting you turn into a human pretzel on my watch. She walked behind the desk and slammed the laptop shut. Jonah's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. You overstep. And you overwork. Wheelchair, living room, 5 minutes, or I'm wheeling you out there myself, and we both know how clumsy I am with the joystick. A muscle in his jaw jumped. But he didn't argue. He reversed the chair, the electric motor whining in the quiet room, and headed for the living room. The physical reality of paralysis was not poetic. It was grueling, unglamorous, and deeply humiliating for a man who had built his life on physical dominance. Stella unrolled the mat on the floor. Frankie, who had been standing guard by the door, wordlessly stepped forward to help lift Jonah out of the chair. Jonah hated the lift. He hated the way his body sagged against Frankie's grip like a sack of wet cement. He hated that his legs dragged uselessly across the carpet. Once Jonah was flat on the mat, Frankie retreated to the hallway, giving them privacy. Stella knelt beside Jonah. He was wearing loose sweatpants and a t-shirt. She took his right ankle and gently bent his knee, bringing it toward his chest. His joints popped loudly in the quiet room. "Does that hurt?" she asked. "I can't feel it," he replied flatly. He stared at the ceiling, his jaw set. "You could stab a kitchen knife into my thigh and I wouldn't blink." "I'll keep that in mind if you keep dodging your vegetables." She worked his right leg, stretching the hamstrings, moving the ankle. The muscles were beginning to atrophy, the stark contrast between his broad, powerful shoulders and his thinning legs becoming more pronounced every week. Stella didn't pity him. She treated his legs like machinery that needed oiling. She moved to his left leg. As she pushed his knee upward, Jonah's abdominal muscles suddenly seized. A violent spasm ripped through his lower half. His left leg kicked out straight, entirely out of his control, the heel striking Stella squarely in the jaw. She fell backward with a sharp cry, landing hard on her elbows. "Stella!" Jonah's voice cracked. He tried to push himself up on his forearms, panic flaring in his dark eyes. His left leg was still rigid, trembling violently on the mat. Stella sat up, rubbing her jaw. She tasted copper. "I'm fine. Jesus, you pack a punch. I didn't—" Jonah stopped. He looked at his leg, still vibrating with spasticity, and then at the red mark blossoming on her chin. The panic in his eyes dissolved into an ocean of profound, toxic shame. He dropped back down onto the mat, throwing his arm over his eyes. "Get out!" "Jonah, it was a reflex." "I said get out!" he roared. His voice was a physical blow, filled with a raw, bleeding hatred. But he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his own body. Stella didn't move. She wiped the small bead of blood from her lip. She crawled back over to him, grabbing his spasming leg with both hands. She pinned the knee down, pressing her body weight against his shin to break the rigid extension. "No," she said, her voice quiet but entirely immovable. "I'm not leaving." "I hit you!" he whispered, his voice shaking. "Your nervous system hit me. I've been hit harder by a malfunctioning vending machine." She kept this pressure steady until the spasm slowly released. His leg went soft again. Stella let go and sat back on her heels. She looked down at him. The arrogant, terrifying mafia boss was gone. In his place was a 34-year-old man who was trapped in a cage of his own bones. "Look at me," Stella said. Jonah slowly moved his arm. His eyes were red-rimmed. "You are not a burden," she told him, her voice fiercely grounded. "You are not broken. You are just fighting a different kind of war now, and you don't get to surrender." Jonah stared at her, his chest rising and falling heavily. For the first time since she had walked into his house, he didn't throw up a wall. He just looked at her, entirely exposed. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly from nerve damage, and traced the line of her jaw where his heel had connected. His thumb brushed against her lower lip. His skin was rough, calloused, and surprisingly warm. "I don't know why you stay," he murmured. "The dental plan," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. A tiny, fractured smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I don't offer a dental plan. Then we need to renegotiate my contract. Weakness attracts predators." 3 weeks after Victor's kneecaps were shattered, a sit-down was called. The old families were getting restless. The docks were bleeding money, shipments were stalling, and the whispers about Jonah Navarro's health were growing into a deafening roar. They demanded a meeting. Neutral ground. The Grand Hotel downtown. "You can't go," Stella said, pacing the length of his bedroom. "It's a 20-minute drive. Getting you in and out of the vehicle is exhausting enough. A 3-hour dinner? Sitting upright the whole time? Your blood pressure will plummet." Jonah was sitting on the edge of the bed, perfectly balanced on his hands. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that hid the thinning of his legs and emphasized the terrifying breadth of his chest. Frankie was adjusting his tie. "If I don't show, they split my territory by midnight," Jonah said calmly. "I go, and you are coming with me." Stella stopped pacing. "Me? Why me?" "Because if my blood pressure plummets, you know how to tilt the chair to fix it. Because you know my medication schedule." "And," Jonah looked up, meeting her eyes, "because they expect me to show up with a nurse in scrubs. You are going to wear a dress, and you are going to look like my date." Stella swallowed hard. "I don't have a dress that belongs in a place with valet parking." 3 hours later, Stella was staring at herself in the massive mirror of the guest suite. Frankie had returned with a garment bag from a boutique downtown. Inside was a floor-length gown in a deep, bruised plum color. It was silk, bass, and clung to her in ways that made her suddenly hyper-aware of her own skin. She had pinned her messy hair up as best she could and applied the only red lipstick she owned. When she walked out into the hallway, Jonah was waiting in his manual wheelchair. He preferred the manual chair for public appearances. The electric one looked too clinical, too much like a hospital bed. He looked at her. He didn't say a word, but the sudden, sharp intake of his breath echoed in the quiet hall. His eyes darkened, tracing the line of her neck down to the slit in the silk skirt. "Will I do?" she asked, suddenly feeling entirely out of her depth. "Keep close to me," Jonah said, his voice a low gravel scrape. "Don't speak to anyone unless I introduce you, and if shooting starts, you drop to the floor. Understand?" "Understood." The dining room at the Grand Hotel was a masterclass in suffocating opulence. Heavy chandeliers dripped with crystal. The table was mahogany, surrounded by men in $10,000 suits. When Jonah entered, the room went dead silent. Frankie pushed the chair to the head of the table. Stella walked at Jonah's right shoulder, keeping her chin high. She felt the eyes of every man in the room lock onto her, then slide down to Jonah's chair. The pity in their eyes was barely veiled. The predatory calculation was completely naked. Sitting to Jonah's left was Leo, an older boss who controlled the northern gambling rings. He smiled, showing a row of tobacco-stained teeth. Jonah, Leo crooned. Good of you to join us. We weren't sure you'd be able to make the trip. The drive was fine, Leo. My mind is sharp, even if you keep wishing otherwise, Jonah replied effortlessly. Frankie locked the brakes on the wheelchair. Stella took the empty seat beside him. Dinner was a psychological war zone. The stakes were rare, the wine was heavy, and every sentence was a loaded gun. They tested Jonah. They talked quickly, throwing complex logistical problems and territorial disputes at him, waiting for him to stumble, waiting for the pain or the fatigue to dull his razor-sharp intellect. He didn't miss a beat. Jonah dismantled their arguments with chilling precision. He recalled figures from memory, leveraged old debts, and stared down the most dangerous men in the city without a drop of sweat on his brow. But Stella, sitting inches away, could see the truth. Underneath the table, his legs were strapped to the footrests to prevent spasms. His breathing was becoming shallow. The lack of core muscle control meant he was using every ounce of strength in his arms and chest just to stay sitting upright without leaning against the backrest. It was a brutal, exhausting performance. By the time dessert was served, Jonah was running on fumes. Leo leaned forward, swirling his brandy. You put on a good show, Jonah. But a man who can't walk his own docks can't hold them. It's time to restructure. There will be no restructuring, Jonah said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. Be reasonable, Leo countered, his smile vanishing. If a war starts, what are you going to do? Run? The insult hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jonah didn't react. He reached out and picked up his heavy crystal brandy glass. He didn't throw it. He simply closed his massive hand around it. The glass shattered. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. Shards of crystal embedded themselves in Jonah's palm. Blood dripped onto the pristine white tablecloth. Half the men at the table reached for their inside pockets. Frankie's hand was already on his gun. Jonah ignored the blood pouring from his hand. He looked at Leo, his eyes dead and empty. I don't need to run, Leo, because if a war starts, I won't be the one bleeding on the floor. I will burn your casinos to the ground from my desk. I will bankrupt your children. I will make you a memory. Leo swallowed, his eyes dropping to the bloody glass on the table. Jonah turned his head slightly. Stella, my hand. Stella's heart was hammering against her ribs, but she forced her hands to remain steady. She grabbed a white cloth napkin, reached over, and firmly wrapped his bleeding hand, tying it tight to staunch the flow. We are done here, Jonah announced. Frankie, the car? They left the room in absolute silence. Jonah had won. He had cemented his terrifying reputation. But the moment the heavy doors of the armored SUV closed, separating them from the world, the facade shattered. Jonah slumped back against the leather seat, his eyes rolling shut, his skin the color of ash. His breathing was ragged. Stella knelt on the floorboard of the moving SUV, ignoring her expensive dress. She grabbed his unwounded hand, pressing her fingers to his pulse. It was racing. You're okay, she whispered, unwrapping the bloody napkin to check the cuts. I've got you. The bleeding is stopping. Jonah opened his eyes. The adrenaline had crashed, leaving him entirely hollowed out. He looked down at her, kneeling in the cramped space, ruining her silk dress on the floor mats. I'm tired, Stella, he whispered. It was the most honest thing he had ever said. She rested her forehead against his knee. I know, just breathe. We're going home. Pride always comes with a price. Leo didn't wait for a war to start. He sent it directly to the front door. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The house was entirely silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the glass. Stella was asleep in the adjoining caregiver's suite, wrapped in an oversized blanket. She woke to the sound of breaking glass. Not a small crash. A massive, concussive shatter that shook the floorboards. Stella bolted upright. The power was out. The bedside clock was dark, and the emergency backup lights in the hallway cast a sickly yellow glow through the crack under her door. Then came the unmistakable muffled pop of suppressed gunfire. Jonah! She scrambled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have armor. She just grabbed the heavy brass lamp off her nightstand, ripped the cord from the wall, and bolted into Jonah's bedroom. Jonah was already awake. He was struggling to drag himself to the edge of the bed using the side rails. Without power, the mechanical lift hanging from the ceiling was useless. His electric wheelchair sat idle and heavy in the corner. "Stella, get down!" Jonah hissed in the darkness. "We need to move." She whispered back, dropping the lamp and running to his side. "The panic room is behind the study. Can we make it?" "Not in the electric chair. Grab the manual one," he ordered, his chest heaving with exertion. Stella ran to the closet and pulled out the lightweight, folding manual wheelchair. She snapped it open next to the bed. Downstairs, a man screamed. It sounded like Frankie. Then, more gunfire. Heavy boots were thudding up the main staircase. They had seconds. "I can't lift you," Stella panicked, looking at Jonah's massive frame. "The slide board." "No time." Jonah grabbed her forearm, his grip bruising. "You pull, I push. Get your arms under my arms. Lock your hands behind my back." Stella didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the mattress, sliding her arms under his heavy armpits, interlocking her fingers tightly against his spine. He smelled like sweat and expensive soap. "On 3, Jonah grunted. 1, 2, 3. Stella threw her entire body weight backward, hauling him toward the edge of the bed. Jonah used his massive upper body strength to launch his hips forward. It was clumsy, brutal, and entirely ungraceful. They crashed off the mattress, Jonah's legs tangling in the sheets, his dead weight slamming into the wheelchair. The chair tipped dangerously on 2 wheels. Stella threw herself against the backrest, forcing it down, pinning the chair to the floor. Jonah was in. He slumped forward, gasping for air, but instantly grabbed the wheels. "Push!" he commanded. Stella grabbed the handles. She shoved the chair out of the bedroom into the yellow-lit hallway. 2 men in black tactical gear were just cresting the top of the stairs at the far end of the corridor. One of them raised an assault rifle. "Down!" Jonah roared. Stella dropped to her knees behind the chair, just as a hail of bullets shredded the drywall above her head. Plaster rained down on her hair. Jonah didn't cower. He pulled a heavy silver revolver from the side pouch of his chair, a weapon he kept hidden for exactly this scenario. He fired twice. The deafening roar of the unsuppressed .357 Magnum in the enclosed hallway was agonizing. The man on the stairs took both rounds in the chest and folded backward, tumbling down the steps. "Keep moving!" Jonah yelled over the ringing in her ears. Stella stayed low, practically crawling, pushing the wheels with bloody, scraped hands. They reached the study doors. She shoved them open. The heavy wood splintered as the second gunman at the end of the hall opened fire again. Inside the dark study, Jonah wheeled himself toward the massive oak bookshelf. "The 3rd panel, push it." Stella scrambled to the shelf, slamming her palm against the wood. A hidden seam clicked, and a heavy steel door slid open, revealing a pitch-black, concrete-lined room. She shoved Jonah's chair inside and squeezed in behind him, hitting the heavy red button on the wall. The steel door slammed shut, sealing them in absolute, suffocating darkness. The heavy thud of bullets hitting the steel from the outside vibrated through the walls, but the metal held. A backup generator hummed to life deep within the walls, and a single dim bulb illuminated the tiny room. It was 8 by 8 feet, stocked with water, trauma kits, and a closed-circuit monitor. Stella collapsed against the steel door, sliding down until she hit the concrete floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, trembling uncontrollably. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving pure, icy terror in its wake. Jonah locked the brakes on his chair. He put the smoking revolver down on a small metal table. He looked at her. Her hands were bleeding. Her pajamas were covered in white plaster dust. She looked small, fragile, and utterly broken. "You shouldn't be here," Jonah said. His voice was ragged, stripped of all authority. "You should have run out the back. They weren't looking for you." "I'm not leaving you to die in a bed," Stella snapped, her teeth chattering. "Stella, look at me." She looked up. "I am half a man," Jonah said, the bitterness in his voice completely unguarded. "I can't protect myself. I couldn't even get into this damn chair without you hauling me like cargo. If they breach that door, I can't stand in front of you. I can't fight them off. You are going to die because I am too broken to save you." Tears, hot and angry, spilled over Stella's eyelashes. She pushed herself off the floor, ignoring the pain in her scraped knees. She walked over to him, grabbing the armrests of his wheelchair, leaning in until they were inches apart. "Don't you ever call yourself half a man again," she whispered fiercely. "You shot a man in the dark to protect me. You dragged yourself out of hell to keep me safe. You are the strongest person I have ever met, Jonah." Jonah stared at her, his chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged breaths. The walls he had built, the iron fortress he kept his emotions locked inside, completely disintegrated. He reached up, burying his hands in her dusty hair, and pulled her down. His mouth crashed against hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and tasted like gun smoke and terror. It was the kiss of a man who was drowning and had finally found a lifeline. Stella didn't pull away. She leaned into it, her hands gripping his broad shoulders, anchoring him, anchoring herself in the tiny, steel-reinforced room while the world burned outside. For the first time since the bullet had shattered his spine, Jonah Navarro felt alive. The steel room smelled like ozone, plaster dust, and copper. The kiss ended not with a dramatic pull-away, but a slow, exhausting collapse. Jonah's forehead dropped to Stella's shoulder. His breathing was heavy, tearing through the quiet hum of the bunker's ventilation fan. Stella kept her hands anchored on his shoulders, her fingers digging into the expensive, ruined fabric of his sleep shirt. She didn't move. She let the reality of what had just happened sink into the concrete walls around them. She had just kissed a man who had murdered someone in the hallway 20 feet away. She had kissed a cartel boss. She had kissed her patient, and her only regret was that she was trembling too hard to hold him tighter. "Stella!" Jonah rasped, his voice muffled against her collarbone. "Don't," she interrupted, her voice a fragile, frayed wire. "Don't apologize. Don't tell me it was the adrenaline. Just shut up for exactly 1 minute and let me breathe." Jonah didn't argue. He turned his face slightly, pressing his lips to the pulse point on her neck. It wasn't sexual. It was a grounding technique. He was listening to the rapid, frantic beat of her heart, letting it anchor his own spiraling nervous system. His lower body was completely numb, dead weight in the metal chair, but his upper body was wired with enough adrenaline to jumpstart a truck. Above them, the closed-circuit monitor flickered. The black and white feed showed the hallway outside the study. Stella turned her head to look. The screen was grainy, but the destruction was undeniable. The mahogany doors were splintered into jagged teeth. The walls looked like Swiss cheese. The man Jonah had shot was a dark, crumpled pile at the bottom of the stairs. Then the bunker radio crackled. "Boss." It was Frankie. His voice was breathless, strained, but alive. Jonah's head snapped up. The vulnerability vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying, cold-blooded intellect that ran the city's underbelly. He wheeled backward slightly, reaching for the radio receiver on the metal desk. "Status," Jonah barked. "House is clear." Frankie coughed heavily over the static. "4 down. They brought heavy ordnance, but they didn't know the layout. They got trapped in the kitchen corridor bottleneck. I took a graze to the ribs. Nothing vital." "Leo's men?" "Yeah. Found a burner on one of them. Last text was a green light from Leo's primary number." Jonah stared at the concrete wall. His eyes were entirely black in the dim light. The muscle in his jaw ticked. "Gather the men. I want a perimeter established in 3 minutes. Nobody leaves, nobody enters. If a police cruiser drives past the gate, you buy them off. If they don't take the cash, you shoot the tires." "Understood. We're clearing the rubble from the study door now." Jonah dropped the receiver. He didn't look at Stella. He was already doing the math, calculating the counter-strike, moving chess pieces on a board only he could see. "We can't stay here," Jonah said, his tone clipped. "The house is compromised. Leo will realize his hit squad failed. He'll send a secondary team, or he'll go to ground. We move to the warehouse district." Stella stood up. Her knees shook, but she locked them. She wiped the plaster dust from her face, leaving a streak of dried blood across her cheek from a small cut. "The warehouse doesn't have a hospital bed, Jonah," she said flatly. "It doesn't have an accessible shower. It doesn't have a generator that can power a mechanical lift. You can't run a war sitting in a folding chair for 4 days. You'll develop pressure ulcers in 48 hours. Jonah finally looked at her. "I don't have a choice." "Yes, you do." Stella stepped closer, her tone stripping away the boss-employee dynamic entirely. "You run your empire. I run you. We are going to the penthouse downtown, the one you said you hate. It has a secure elevator, reinforced glass, and most importantly, a mattress that won't send you into a spastic crisis. Frankie can secure the lobby." Jonah's eyes narrowed. "I don't take orders. You do when it comes to your spine." Stella countered, crossing her arms. She looked ridiculous in her dusty pajamas and scraped knees, but her voice held the immovable weight of an iron girder. "If you go into autonomic dysreflexia because you decided to play tough guy in a damp warehouse, you'll have a stroke. Then Leo wins by default. We go to the penthouse." They stared at each other. The air crackled. It was a battle of wills between a man who commanded killers and a woman who armed herself with soup ladles. A heavy metallic thud echoed against the steel door. "Boss?" Frankie's voice came through the thick metal. "Door's clear." Jonah held Stella's gaze for a second longer. Then a ghost of a smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Frankie," Jonah called out, "have the armored cars brought to the garage. We're going to the penthouse." The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel in the sky. For 3 days, it became the nerve center of a brutal, unseen war. Jonah didn't sleep. He sat at the massive glass dining table, surrounded by 4 laptops and a half-dozen burner phones. He was orchestrating the systematic dismantling of Leo's empire. He didn't send men with guns to kick down doors. He sent numbers. He froze offshore accounts. He redirected cargo ships carrying Leo's contraband to federal customs checkpoints. He leaked the locations of Leo's illegal gambling dens to rival syndicates. He was bleeding the old boss dry, stripping him of money, allies, and territory without firing a single shot himself. But the physical toll was devastating. By the evening of the 3rd day, the stress was breaking Jonah's body down. Stella walked into the main living area carrying a tray with a glass of water and a small plastic cup of pills. Jonah was on the phone, speaking rapidly in Italian, his voice hoarse. His skin was pale, shining with a cold sweat. He was gripping the edge of the glass table so hard that his knuckles were entirely white. "Cut the feed to the North Docks!" Jonah ordered the phone. "I don't care if it costs us! Burn it!" He dropped the phone and squeezed his eyes shut. A harsh, jagged breath ripped through his teeth. Stella set the tray down instantly. "Jonah, I'm fine," he ground out, not opening his eyes. "Just a headache." Stella stepped behind his wheelchair. She placed her hand on the back of his neck. His skin was burning. "You're sweating. Your breathing is shallow. When was the last time you emptied your leg bag?" Jonah swatted her hand away, his temper flaring. "I said I'm fine, Stella. I need to make 2 more calls. Leo is cornered at the shipyard." Stella ignored him. She dropped to her knees beside his chair and pulled up the leg of his slacks. The urinary catheter bag strapped to his calf was completely full. The tubing kinked violently from where he had been sitting in the exact same position for 7 hours. "Damn it, Jonah!" she swore, immediately unkinking the tube. "Your bladder is distended. Your nervous system is panicking." Jonah suddenly gripped the arms of his chair. His chest heaved. "My head, it's pounding. Autonomic dysreflexia," Stella said, panic spiking in her chest. It was the terrifying reality of spinal cord injuries. A blocked catheter or a tight shoe could trigger a massive, lethal spike in blood pressure because the brain couldn't receive the pain signals to fix the problem. She scrambled up and ran to the medical bag she had brought from the estate. She yanked out the blood pressure cuff and a tube of nitroglycerin paste. She ran back and wrapped the cuff around his massive bicep, pumping it rapidly. Jonah's head dropped back against the chair. The veins in his neck bulged. His vision was blurring. "Stella, I'm here. Stay with me," she ordered, watching the dial on the gauge. It climbed past 180, past 200. It stopped at 215 over 115, stroke territory. "Okay, tilt back," she said, grabbing the handles of the manual chair and tilting him entirely backward onto the rear wheels, using her own body weight to hold him at a 45-degree angle to drop the blood pressure in his head. With her free hand, she tore open the nitro paste. "Open your shirt." Jonah's hands were shaking violently. He couldn't grasp the buttons. "Forget it," Stella said. She grabbed the collar of his bespoke shirt and ripped it open, sending small pearl buttons scattering across the hardwood floor. She smeared a thick strip of the medicinal paste directly over his heart. "Breathe, Jonah. Deep, slow breaths. The tube is unkinked. The source is clear. You just have to wait for the pressure to drop." They stayed in that bizarre, tense tableau for 5 minutes. Stella balancing the heavy wheelchair on its back wheels, her arm burning with the effort, while the most feared man in the city gasped for air like a drowning swimmer. Slowly, agonizingly, the color began to recede from his face. The violent pounding in his neck slowed. Stella checked his pressure again. 150 over 90. Dropping. Safe. She gently lowered the front wheels back to the floor. She was panting, her hair clinging to her forehead. She knelt in front of him, resting her hands on his knees. Jonah stared down at his chest, at the ruined shirt and the medical paste. The illusion of absolute power he had projected for 3 days was completely shattered. He looked exhausted. He looked defeated. "I'm a liability," Jonah whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I can destroy a cartel with a laptop, but a kinked piece of plastic almost killed me." "It's biology, Jonah. It's not a moral failing," Stella said fiercely. "It's weakness." "It's life!" Stella yelled, shocking them both. She pushed herself up, pacing in front of him. "You think able-bodied people don't have aneurysms? You think they don't get hit by buses? You are trapped in this idea that you have to be invincible to be worthy of your title. You aren't invincible. You're human. You sit in a chair. You need help going to the bathroom. And you also just single-handedly dismantled a 50-year-old mafia family in 72 hours. Both of those things are true at the exact same time." Jonah watched her. The fiery, chaotic energy she radiated was the only thing cutting through the bleakness of his reality. One of the burner phones on the table buzzed. Frankie's voice came through the speaker. "Boss, it's done. Leo's guys surrendered the shipyard. Leo tried to run. We stopped his car on the bridge." A heavy silence followed. "Do we bring him in?" Frankie asked. Jonah looked at Stella. He looked at her scraped hands, the circles under her eyes, the fierce, protective stance she held. He had started this war to protect his territory. He was ending it to protect her. "No," Jonah said into the phone, his voice cold, steady, and entirely devoid of mercy. "Throw him off the bridge. Leave the car running." "Understood." The line went dead. The war was over. Jonah reached out. He caught Stella's hand, lacing his thick fingers through hers. He pulled her gently toward him until she was standing directly between his knees. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her stomach. Stella slowly brought her hands down, running her fingers through his dark, thick hair. She didn't say a word. She just held him, absorbing the violent, terrifying reality of the man she had somehow tied herself to. 6 months later, the Navarro estate had been rebuilt. The splintered mahogany doors were replaced with reinforced steel disguised as wood. The driveway gravel had been paved over with smooth, seamless asphalt to make rolling a wheelchair easier. The changes were subtle, but they were there. Concessions to a new reality, made not out of defeat, but out of adaptation. It was a Sunday morning. The house was quiet. Frankie was drinking coffee in the security booth by the gate. Stella was in the kitchen, aggressively attempting to flip a pancake. She was wearing an oversized t-shirt and a pair of thick wool socks. The pancake hit the edge of the pan, folded in half, and spilled raw batter onto the stovetop. "Damn it," she muttered, grabbing a towel. "You hold the spatula too tight," a rough voice said from the doorway. Stella turned. Jonah was sitting in his electric wheelchair. He was wearing dark sweatpants and a fitted grey t-shirt. He looked healthier. The hollows in his cheeks had filled out. His shoulders were broader, heavily muscled from daily physical therapy. His legs were still thin, still useless, but he no longer hid them under heavy blankets. He rolled into the kitchen, navigating the smooth floor with effortless precision. He pulled up next to the stove, reaching out to take the spatula from her hand. "It's all in the wrist," he said, effortlessly sliding the spatula under a second pancake and flipping it perfectly. "Show off," Stella grumbled, bumping her hip against his shoulder. "I run a criminal enterprise, Stella. Flipping batter is child's play. You run a legitimate shipping logistics company now," Stella corrected him, leaning against the counter. "Mostly legitimate. I saw the tax returns. You're practically boring now." Jonah turned his head, looking up at her. The cold, dead look that used to live in his eyes was gone. In its place was a quiet, dangerous warmth. "I can have someone's kneecaps broken by noon if you're feeling nostalgic." "I'll pass. I just mopped." He set the spatula down and reached for her. He grabbed the hem of her oversized shirt and pulled her into his lap. Stella went willingly, throwing her legs over the armrest of the chair, settling against his chest. She rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the smell of his expensive soap. They had navigated the terrifying transition from employer-employee to whatever they were now. It hadn't been easy. There were days of intense frustration, days when Jonah's nerve pain was so bad he couldn't speak, and Stella had to sit in the dark with him, holding his hand while he rode it out. There were the complicated, unglamorous mechanics of physical intimacy, the careful positioning, the spasms, the profound vulnerability of a man who had to learn how to love without half his body. But they had figured it out. They communicated in the brutal, honest language they had forged in the dark. "Dr. Aris wants to try the new standing frame next week," Stella murmured, tracing the line of his collarbone. "It'll help bone density." "I hate the standing frame. It makes me feel like a prop." "You're doing it anyway, or I'll cook dinner for a week." Jonah groaned loudly. "That is extortion. I'll call my lawyers." "Your lawyers are terrified of me." "Everyone is terrified of you, Stella. You wield a cast-iron skillet like a medieval mace." Jonah wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against his chest. He couldn't feel the weight of her legs across his lap, but he could feel the warmth of her body pressing against his torso. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest. He leaned back, looking at the messy, chaotic, beautiful woman who had crashed into his tomb of a house and demanded that he live. "I was dead before you walked in here," Jonah said softly, the humor fading into something deeply sincere. "You weren't dead," Stella replied, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "You were just waiting." "For what?" "For someone who didn't care about the wheelchair, or the money, or the mob." She smiled, leaning in to press her lips to his jaw. "Someone who just needed the dental plan." Jonah laughed, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. He captured her lips in a slow, deep kiss that tasted like coffee and morning sunlight. The ghosts of his past, the phantom pains, the enemies in the shadows, they were all still there. But they no longer owned him. He was Jonah Navarro. He was paralyzed. He was a boss. And for the first time in his life, he was home. From surviving a brutal mob hit in a dark, panic room to finding love in the messy, unforgiving reality of life, Jonah and Stella proved that true strength isn't about standing up. It's about who stays by your side when you can't. If this deeply human, gritty mafia romance kept you hooked until the very end, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more original, grounded storytelling. What was your favorite moment between Jonah and Stella? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a real, imperfect romance.